It was supposed to be just a regular busy week at the Panama Canal, one of the globe's best maritime routes in commons and a marvel of maritime engineering. But then, the locks slowed, the traffic gradually stalled, and eventually, tens of hundreds of ships were left circling and rerouting thousands of miles off the course of Panama Canal. Why? Let me tell you what happened that day in mid-2023. You see, the Panama Canal isn't just a marvel of maritime engineering. It's a key route in global logistics network because roughly 5% of global trade pass through that 80-kilometer stretch of the canal connecting the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. In fact, every year, around 14,000 vessels make the journey, shaving off weeks from shipping routes that would otherwise be much more longer if they had gone around Cape Horn. So for energy traders, for car carriers, for automobile port shippers and container lines, this Panama Canal is a lifeline. But for the first time in the history of modern shipping, that canal was not blocked by any ship directly or indirectly, but was blocked by nature herself. The same reason the canal was designed, constructed, completed in 1914. So while it is clear that the objective behind the construction of the canal was to allow ships bypass the treacherous southern tip of South America, the engineering design was done in a way that the locks system of the canal does not operate using seawater. It operates using freshwater from nearby lakes, and that water depends heavily on rainfall. Now let me bring you back to 2023 and nature herself struck, but this time with a negative impact on the canal. Panama was facing its worst drought in decades. The rainfall level has dropped dangerously low due to a shifting El Niño pattern. An El Niño pattern is a weather pattern that causes unusual warm surface waters to appear in the central and eastern tropical Pacific Ocean. Now, this unusual appearance of warm water leads to disruption in global weather. This disruption in global weather brings about more rain in certain areas like the US West Coast, but it brings about severe droughts and heat waves in other places like Panama. So the shifting El Niño pattern deeply brought the Gatun Lake, which is the Panama Canal's freshwater reservoir and primary source, to a dangerously low level. And because the level of the water has dropped so low, it started to make it difficult for the lock system of the canal to operate properly, even at all. Now, the Panama Authority, upon seeing the dangerously low level of this canal, decided to come up with some drastic decisions. First, they imposed a draft restriction. This draft restriction limits how deep vessels that are crossing the canal could sit in the water. The draft restriction here means that the Panama Authority are saying that there is a certain level of depth a vessel could sit in the water or in the canal, which means that ships would have to reduce their weight, typically by carrying less cargo, to avoid going below the certain depth that the Panama Authority has put in place regarding the canal. So if you have a ship approaching the Panama Canal full of vessels to the teeth, you may not be allowed to ply through the Panama Canal because of the impact of that ship on the water. And so because they do not want a ship that would go deep into the water, they are preferring ships that have lesser cargoes on them. Now, as if that was not all, the next thing the Authority of Panama did was to slash the daily transits ply through that canal. Initially, I have said that over 14,000 vessels ply through that canal every year. Now, when you break that 14,000 vessels into daily you end with 38 vessels that ply through there every day on the average. Now, the Panama Authority had to slash that amount from 38 to 24. That alone would increase delays. That alone with breach delivery time would increase cost of transportation. Just from that slash alone, the impact has already started to show. Now we're talking about, first, the ships or the vessels that's going to ply through the canal would have to go with half a vessel. Next, they are also being told that even if your ship is not fully loaded and qualifies to ply through the canal, you would have to be on queue because 38 vessels are no longer allowed to ply through the canal, but 24. So you're losing money and you're losing time as well. And they also went further to say that if you do want to skip the queue, say for instance, you have seasonal cargoes on your vessels, sensitive cargo on your vessel, you would have to pay millions to jump the queue. So you can literally start to see the impact on these drastic decisions that would now cascade into ripping off millions, hundreds of millions of dollars from the supply chain industry and bring about sad effect on the customers that happens to be at the bottom of the chain. So just think about it this way. Imagine that you have a ship that's carrying containers of Christmas materials or seasonal goods or time-sensitive auto parts across the ocean, and upon getting to the canal, the Panama Canal, the authorities at the Panama Canal tells them that you cannot cross with a fully loaded ship because of the dangerously low level of the water at Gatun Lake, making it impossible or difficult for the lock system of the Panama Canal to operate properly. That vessel you have that is fully loaded would not cross except you have to reduce the amount of cargoes on the ship. Next, they tell you that you would also have to be on queue for days on end. You do not know when you're going to cross because now you have hundreds of ships already piling, so you'd have to join them because vessels that ply through that canal used to be 38 and now they're 24. Then they go on to tell you that if you do want to get ahead in the queue, you would have to pay millions of dollars. Insane. Now, you can clearly start to see the ripple effect of those decisions from one error, from one engineering error that occurred at the Panama Canal. So you have energy shippers, automobile parts and seasonal goods shippers who, upon hearing these new limitations and new authorizations from the Panama Authority, starts to seek out alternative routes. Because a vessel is transporting fuel, for instance, it's not going to just empty half its fuel. There is no guarantee that this cargo will arrive at an agreed upon delivery time wherever the customer was expecting those vessels. And even if they go on to pay millions of dollars, how long, how soon are they going to cross the canal? Now, because of all of these unanswered questions, shippers, automobile parts shippers, energy shippers, seasonal goods shippers were then looking for alternative routes to boycott the Panama Canal. And eventually they settled for a route known as the Suez Canal. And the thing about going through the Suez Canal is that it will add 14 extra days of sailing. So if, for instance, your shipment is supposed to, if going through the Panama Canal takes 30 days on sea, you now have to add an extra 14 days on it. So that makes it 44 days that your shipment may likely be on sea if that vessel decides to go through the Suez Canal. Now, think about the ripple effects, the impacts the 14 days reroute would then have in the supply chain industry as a whole. For instance, automobile and retail companies literally were facing shipment delays, and those delays brought about a slow production in factories. Those slow production would lead to laying off staff. Those slow production would then lead to hiking up prices of available commodities, not to mention deadlines that were breached, not to mention contracts that were terminated. not to mention hundreds of millions of dollars that were lost, and above all, customer loyalty in many cases dwindled drastically. And if you want to know more about the impact of the Red Sea reroute and its effects on our daily purchases, please, you can go take a listen to my episode 8 of my podcast titled The Red Sea Reroute. Now, for the shippers that decides to opt for the draft restriction placed by the Panama Authority and then goes ahead to pay to get ahead in the queue, information has it that most of these shippers had to pay an upward of $2.4 million in auction fee just to secure a slot. Now, even if they do get a slot, they still have to wait. Wait for how long, they do not know. Each day spent waiting to cross the Panama Canal is resources, time, and cash burn daily. So, every shipper is then caught between the devil and the deep blue sea. Do I pay the millions of dollars, reduce my vessel by half or by a quarter, and stay in this Panama queue that consists of hundreds of vessels, and I do not know when this vessel of mine is going to cross? What I have on that vessel are seasonal goods. What I have on that vessel are products that are needed just in time to complete customer demand for vehicles. What I have in that vessel are fuel, diesel, petroleum products that needs to be delivered as soon as possible. Do I pay that huge amount of money, stay in the queue, or do I seek alternative route through the Suez Canal, having 14 extra days added to the time of delivery? So it's quite dicey situation to be in as a customer or as an importer. And all of this time wastage, all of these money spent and resources spent most often trickle down to the customers at the end of the day. And for shippers that are moving perishable goods, think about the millions of dollars that will be lost. So what are they going to go through the Suez Canal and spend extra 14 days? What are they going to stay in the queue at the Panama Canal and spend days idle? So you see, the Panama Canal crisis wasn't just a freak event. No, it became pretty clear that the Panama Canal is a preview of how, regardless of the marvel of engineering humans can come up with, at times, climate variability can directly disrupt global supply chain. Because if you think about it thoroughly, how can an infrastructure that carries 5% of the global trade and maritime transportation, that is about 14,000 vessels plying that canal every year, depends heavily on predictable rainfall? Yet, it came to a chaotic disruption by a lack of rainfall. And rather than having the Panama Canal accelerate trade, the Panama Canal slowed it down at a time when the world wasn't ready, at a time when the world was just recovering from the Suez Canal crisis that occurred 2 years prior. This is a maritime chokepoint that was designed in 20th century or completed in 1914, and how humans and engineers assumed that this chokepoint that was made in 1914 can handle highly unpredictable climate volatility in our century is something that baffled me. How we continue to rely on an engineering construction done in 1914 when the world has moved by billions in population, resources have increased by billions, development has increased, the market has increased by billions, yet we continue to rely on an infrastructure that was highly dependent on nature itself, the same nature that ruined and caused chaos throughout the supply chain network. So what lessons did authorities, exporters, shippers, manufacturers learned after the Panama chaotic situation? First, that drought forced each player in the maritime trade network to rethink their playbook, to reassess their over-reliance on single maritime choke points at the Panama Canal, at the Suez Canal. Again, I talked about the Suez Canal blockage in episode 1 of my podcast. You can take a listen about it I talked about the Red Sea reroute in episode 8. You can also take a listen about it, how these choke points has continued to affect supply chains. Secondly, some of these companies or these exporters and importers started to look into alternative routes like the Arctic Passage, like the passages around Africa. You will see companies, importers, exporters exploring these alternative routes or corridors because they do not want what happened at the Suez Canal, what happened at the Panama Canal to happen again and ruin their business or cost them millions that has never or can never be recovered. Also, we've come to see new rail lines being constructed, rail transportation corridors being expanded between countries, having alternative from the maritime transportation to rail lines so that if for any reason nature decides to strike again, there will be alternatives in moving goods as quickly as possible. And then for policymakers like the Panama Authority, for instance, they began to explore new water reservoirs. They had to rethink on why should we be dependent on the Gatun Lake as the major reservoir and the primary source of water for the Panama Canal. So that's a huge question that I was surprised that they never had the time to think about or ask themselves prior to 2023. They had to start developing new water reservoirs. They had to start looking into conservation technologies to secure the canal's future and prevent such events from occurring again. So sometimes something drastic, something chaotic has to happen in the supply chain ecosystem to shake the comfortability that we humans have and then give us the opportunity to rethink our over-reliance on certain choke points. It happened with the Suez Canal, it happened with the Red Sea reroute, and it happened again with the Panama Canal. So it's a good thing that the authorities of Panama decided to make research, to look into getting new reservoirs, to look into conservation technologies on how they can secure the canal's future and prevent such thing from happening again. So clearly the Panama chaos is not just about the fact that shipments or vessels had to look for reroutes or pay millions of dollars. No, it made us come to one drastic realization that we cannot be over-reliant on certain choke points. We need to diversify. We need to explore more ways so that when something happens to one, there's another avenue we can explore. Because the truth is this, it will happen again. Yes, it will. But when it will happen, will we be ready to look for an alternative as soon as possible or get it fixed as soon as possible? So that's all for this week's episode on Tales of Logistics Customs Cut series. Thank you for joining and listening to our episode. And if you do enjoy this episode, please subscribe. Please share it with your network. You can listen to my podcast. Leave a review for me. I would appreciate that as well. Thank you for listening and see you in our next episode. Voila.